For years, people kept asking the same question about Jim Carrey. Was he really leaving? Was he serious this time? Or was this just another one of those strange, impossible-to-read Jim Carrey moments that sound like a joke until years later, when you realize he meant every word? Because when a man like Jim Carrey says, "I have enough. I've done enough. I am enough," that doesn't sound like a normal celebrity taking a break. That sounds like someone closing a chapter that fame could never fully understand. And maybe that is the truth no one wanted to face. Maybe this was never simply about retirement. Maybe this was about escape. Not escape from acting alone, not escape from Hollywood alone, but escape from the version of himself that the world kept demanding over and over again. The wild face. The elastic body. The unstoppable energy. The man who could walk into a frame and detonate it with one expression. Audiences thought they were watching freedom. But what if, all along, Jim Carrey was performing from inside a cage? That is what makes his future feel finally decided. Not because he can never appear on a screen again. Not because he could never surprise the world one more time. But because something deeper appears to be over forever. The Jim Carrey who chased the machine, who fed the machine, who sacrificed himself to keep the machine entertained, may already be gone. To understand why that matters, you have to go back before the red carpets, before the million-dollar contracts, before the legend. Back to a kid growing up in Canada in a family that knew anxiety more intimately than comfort. Before the world knew him as a human cartoon, he was a boy in a house where money was fragile, security was temporary, and laughter was not a luxury. It was survival. His father had talent. His father had musical instincts. His father also had responsibilities, bills, pressure, and the crushing knowledge that talent alone does not guarantee escape. That contradiction imprinted itself on Jim early. Dream big if you want. Life can still put a mop in your hand. Then came the collapse. The kind of collapse that doesn't just hurt a family financially, but emotionally brands everyone inside it. Stability disappeared. Pride disappeared. Childhood disappeared. Jim didn't just witness struggle. He absorbed it. He watched what failure, humiliation, and fear can do to a person. He saw how fast life can strip a man of certainty. And somewhere in that chaos, the lesson went in deep. If pain is unavoidable, then maybe the only power left is to transform it. Maybe the only way to fight darkness is to become louder than it. Funnier than it. More alive than it. That is where the real Jim Carrey was born. Not in Hollywood. Not on television. Not in movies. He was born in that desperate collision between fear and performance, between instability and imagination. He learned that if he could make people laugh, he could change the temperature of a room. He could interrupt dread. He could make people forget, even if only for a moment, how heavy life felt. For some children, comedy is a talent. For Jim Carrey, it became a defense mechanism so powerful that the world later mistook it for pure joy. And that misunderstanding would define his entire life. As a teenager, he was already stretching himself toward a future nobody around him could guarantee. He could imitate people. Twist his face into impossible shapes. Pull attention toward himself like gravity. But the early path was not magical. It was humiliating, exhausting, and uncertain. There were bad nights, awkward silences, tiny paychecks, and the terrible loneliness that comes from believing you are meant for something bigger while your actual life keeps reminding you how far away that bigger really is. Still, he kept going. And that is one of the most important truths about Jim Carrey. His rise was not built on confidence alone. It was built on obsession. On the refusal to stop. On the kind of internal pressure that doesn't let you rest because rest feels too close to disappearing. Every failed set, every rejection, every small opportunity only hardened the larger instinct inside him. He was not merely trying to become successful. He was trying to outrun a version of life he had already seen too closely. When he eventually made his way to Los Angeles, he did not arrive as a polished star. He arrived hungry. Hungry in the literal sense, yes, but even more hungry in the spiritual sense. Hungry to prove that all the chaos, all the fear, all the years of pushing against the walls of poverty and uncertainty were leading somewhere. He was still an outsider, still trying to turn raw energy into something the industry could recognize, package, and sell. But what made Jim Carrey dangerous was that he did not behave like anyone else. He didn't just want to tell jokes. He wanted to become an event. That quality is what finally opened doors for him. Not because he looked safe. Not because he looked refined. But because he looked uncontainable. And once that kind of performer finds the right platform, things don't rise gradually. They explode. Television gave him a place to sharpen the weapon. On sketch comedy, he wasn't merely funny. He was disruptive. He took physical comedy and pushed it until it became almost violent in its intensity. Every muscle in his body seemed enlisted. Every scene looked like it might spin out of control. That was the thrill. Viewers had the sense that he was not just playing characters. He was hurling himself into them. He wasn't acting at a comfortable distance. He was disappearing into exaggeration and dragging the audience in with him. And suddenly, the industry had to reckon with something rare. A performer who was not just amusing, not just charismatic, but unforgettable. A performer whose face alone could become a spectacle. A performer who could dominate a scene so completely that everyone else in it became background noise. That kind of power creates stars. It also creates traps. Because once the world discovers the version of you that makes the biggest impact, it starts asking for that version forever. Then came the year that turned Jim Carrey into something beyond famous. It turned him into a phenomenon. In what still feels like one of the most insane star-making runs in modern comedy history, he became the face of multiple hit films almost at once. One movie established him as a box office force. Another transformed him into a pop culture hurricane. Another cemented the image of Jim Carrey as the uncontested master of manic comedic energy. It wasn't merely success. It was saturation. He wasn't just in theaters. He was everywhere. And the more people laughed, the more the mythology around him grew. Jim Carrey was no longer just an actor. He was a force of nature. A rubber-limbed miracle. A one-man explosion machine. A performer so visually and vocally aggressive that even mediocre material could be elevated by his presence alone. He gave comedies a kind of danger, because even when the script was silly, you had the feeling that he might do something you had never seen before. That unpredictability made him irresistible. But what the audience experienced as joy may have been, for him, another kind of pressure. Because if your greatest gift is your ability to become larger than life, how do you ever return to normal size? If millions of people love the most extreme version of you, what happens when you no longer feel capable of sustaining that extremity? At what point does talent stop feeling like freedom and start feeling like obligation? That is the hidden tragedy inside the Jim Carrey story. The very qualities that made him immortal as a performer also made him vulnerable as a person. The face, the voice, the chaos, the speed, the total lack of inhibition on camera. Those things made him rich, famous, and impossible to ignore. But they also made the world hungry for a version of him that no human being could perform forever without cost. And the cost was not small. Success brought money. It brought power. It brought control over projects, leverage in negotiations, and the surreal transformation from struggling comic to one of the most highly paid stars in Hollywood. But external triumph does not automatically repair internal fractures. In fact, sometimes it magnifies them. Because once you have reached the level you dreamed about, you lose the fantasy that success will finally make everything quiet inside. You discover that the applause can be deafening and still not heal you. You discover that being wanted is not the same as being at peace. That realization seems to have stalked Jim Carrey for years. You could hear it in his interviews long before people were ready to take them seriously. He would say things that sounded mystical, contradictory, funny, unsettling. People laughed because he was Jim Carrey. But beneath the eccentric delivery was a recurring idea. Identity itself had become unstable for him. He didn't seem interested in just being a celebrity. He seemed suspicious of the whole performance of being a person in public. Suspicious of fame. Suspicious of ego. Suspicious even of the character called Jim Carrey. And if you look at his filmography, that tension starts to feel almost prophetic. The Truman Show was not just a brilliant career move. It was an eerie mirror. A story about a man whose entire life has become an artificial performance for other people, and who slowly begins to feel that something about his reality is deeply wrong. That role hit harder because Jim Carrey, beneath all the comedy, understood what it means to be watched, to be consumed, to be turned into a source of emotion for strangers. In that film, laughter gave way to loneliness. Performance gave way to awakening. And maybe audiences sensed it immediately. They weren't just watching him prove he could act dramatically. They were watching a comedian reveal the prison hidden inside his own gift. Then he went even further. He took roles that blurred identity, roles that required immersion, roles that seemed less like performances and more like psychic invasions. When he embodied Andy Kaufman, it didn't feel like a safe career expansion. It felt dangerous. The deeper he went into that kind of work, the more the line between transformation and self-erasure started to disappear. For many actors, disappearing into a role is the dream. For someone already struggling with the instability of persona, it can become something darker. Not liberation, but dissolution. That is why Jim Carrey's life has always felt like two stories happening at once. On the surface, there is the obvious one. Poor kid becomes comic titan, dominates Hollywood, earns fortunes, builds a legacy, becomes beloved across generations. But underneath that is another story, and it may be the more important one. A story about a person trying again and again to discover whether there is anything real left underneath the masks that made the world adore him. And maybe that is why his quieter performances land with such force. In films where he stops lunging for laughs and simply sits inside sadness, memory, regret, confusion, or longing, people see a different Jim Carrey. Not the cartoon. Not the detonator. Not the shape-shifting engine of chaos. They see the ache underneath. They see the man who always seemed to be running faster than something. In those moments, it becomes clear that his comedy was never empty. It was pain electrified. As the years passed, his public image became stranger to mainstream audiences. Some people thought he had become detached. Some thought he had become cryptic for attention. Some thought he was spiraling. But there was also another possibility. Maybe he was one of the few celebrities honest enough to say out loud what fame does to a person when it stops being a dream and becomes a distortion field. Maybe the bizarre interviews and spiritual language were not random at all. Maybe they were the sound of someone trying to speak after spending decades being rewarded for performance more than honesty. He stepped away more often. He painted. He talked about stillness, about existence, about consciousness, about the emptiness of external achievement. To many, it looked like a late-career eccentric phase. But if you trace the line back through his life, it looks less like a phase and more like a destination. A man who spent his childhood learning to create laughter out of instability, then spent adulthood turning himself into one of the most recognizable entertainers on the planet, eventually arrived at a conclusion almost no one expected from a superstar. Maybe none of this is the answer. That conclusion became impossible to ignore when he openly spoke about retirement. He didn't frame it like a negotiation. He didn't make it sound like a publicity stunt. He sounded calm, almost relieved. He said he had enough. He said he had done enough. He said he was enough. In an industry built on endless appetite, those words felt almost rebellious. Hollywood understands ambition. It understands reinvention, comeback stories, and strategic rebrands. What it does not understand easily is renunciation. Someone voluntarily stepping back not because they failed, not because nobody wants them, but because they no longer want the chase in the same way. That is far more threatening to the machine. Variety. Of course, the story did not end cleanly there. Because Jim Carrey is still Jim Carrey. He returned. He joked. He undercut his own myth with that brutally funny line about buying a lot of stuff and needing the money. That quote made headlines because it sounded so blunt, so hilariously unfiltered, so perfectly Jim. But if you listen carefully, it does not erase the retirement story. It complicates it. He came back, yes. He returned to a familiar character, yes. He proved again that he could still command attention, yes. But a return is not always a reversal. Sometimes it is just a brief re-entry before the final departure. Variety. That matters because the future of Jim Carrey no longer feels like the future of a man climbing toward something. It feels like the future of a man deciding what he is finally unwilling to sacrifice. And that is a very different kind of story. The younger Jim Carrey would have treated the next role, the next laugh, the next triumph as a battle to win. The older Jim Carrey seems more interested in asking whether the battle itself was ever worth the damage. That is not weakness. That is not decline. That is perspective earned at an unbearable price. And maybe that is the most powerful reason this goodbye forever narrative hits people so deeply. Because Jim Carrey does not feel like just another actor stepping back. He feels like a symbol from an era when stars gave the world everything. Their face, their body, their sanity, their privacy, their contradictions, their pain. They turned themselves into entertainment at industrial scale. And Jim Carrey may be one of the clearest examples of what happens when a person does that too well. The world celebrates the magic. The person carrying it pays the bill. Think about the emotional logic of his whole life. A child learns that making people laugh can push back darkness. A young performer discovers that intensity gets attention. A rising comic realizes that going bigger gets rewarded. A star becomes globally famous by amplifying himself beyond human proportions. Then the same man spends later years talking about quiet, stillness, detachment, enoughness, and peace. That is not random. That is a complete arc. That is someone who reached the far edge of performance and discovered that beyond it was exhaustion. So when people ask whether Jim Carrey's future is finally decided, maybe they are asking the wrong question. Maybe the real question is this: which future are we talking about? The public future, where studios wonder if he will return for another film. The nostalgic future, where fans hope for one more classic performance. Or the private future, where a man who has already lived several lifetimes inside one career chooses what remains of himself. Because those are not the same thing. And the last one is the only one that truly matters now. What he has said publicly in recent years gives us a clue. Stepping away, he explained, gave him a new appreciation and a different angle on his work. He also made it clear that he values not always being in people's faces. That is not the language of a man desperate to stay visible. That is the language of someone who has already tasted overexposure and no longer worships it. News. And that is why this does feel, in a deeper sense, like goodbye forever. Not necessarily goodbye to acting in the literal, absolute, contractual sense. Hollywood loves sequels, surprises, reversals, and impossible returns. No one should pretend they can predict every future decision of an artist. But goodbye forever to the old arrangement. Goodbye to the assumption that Jim Carrey exists to keep delivering himself on demand. Goodbye to the belief that one more hit, one more role, one more resurgence is what defines him. Goodbye to the engine that once turned personal intensity into public spectacle without asking what it was costing the person inside. Because if there is one thing Jim Carrey seems to understand now, it is that being loved by millions and being whole are not the same achievement. That realization changes the meaning of everything that came before. The wild grin becomes sadder. The explosive performances become more heroic. The weird interviews become more understandable. The spiritual searching becomes less ridiculous and more inevitable. When you see the full arc, you stop looking at him like a celebrity behaving strangely and start looking at him like a man who went all the way through fame and came back carrying a warning. The warning is simple. Success can give you scale, but not peace. Money can give you options, but not identity. Applause can confirm your power, but not your worth. And a man who spent decades proving he could make the world laugh may ultimately be remembered most deeply for the moment he stepped outside the whole illusion and said, in effect, I don't need this in the same way anymore. That is why his story lingers. Not because he was funny, though he was. Not because he was brilliant, though he absolutely was. Not even because he became one of the defining performers of his generation. His story lingers because it touches something raw in everybody watching. The fear that the version of ourselves that gets rewarded might not be the version that can save us. The fear that we can become excellent at surviving in a way that slowly disconnects us from peace. The fear that by the time the world says, you made it, we may already be too exhausted to enjoy what that means. Jim Carrey's future may indeed be decided now. Not by contracts. Not by studios. Not by box office projections. Not by fan campaigns demanding one more comeback, but by a quieter instinct that seems to have been growing in him for years. The instinct to stop performing where performance is no longer necessary. The instinct to protect what remains. The instinct to choose truth over appetite, even if the world finds that less entertaining. And maybe that is the bravest thing he has ever done. Because it is one thing to make people laugh. It is one thing to dominate screens, redefine comedy, and become a cultural force so massive that your face alone can trigger memories across generations. But it is another thing entirely to look at all of that power, all of that history, all of that mythology, and say, I do not belong to this forever. For the audience, that feels like loss. For Hollywood, it feels like unfinished business. For nostalgia, it feels almost unbearable. But for Jim Carrey, it may finally feel like freedom. So yes, maybe this really is goodbye forever. Not goodbye to legacy. That will outlive all of us. Not goodbye to the films that made him immortal. They are already part of cinematic memory. Not even goodbye to the possibility that one day he might reappear, grin sideways at the camera, and remind the world that he can still do what almost nobody else ever could. But goodbye forever to the old hunger. Goodbye forever to the idea that his value must be renewed through constant visibility. Goodbye forever to the machine that fed on his intensity and called it entertainment. Goodbye forever to the version of Jim Carrey who had to prove himself by becoming bigger, louder, and more unforgettable than everyone else in the room. That man gave everything. And maybe, at long last, he has decided that what remains of his life belongs to him.